for tonight, we read a pamphlet by Lenin and Zinoviev from September of 1915 called Socialism and War. And y'all can see my screen, okay? Or my slideshow. The pamphlet was written for the Zimmerwald conference. This was an anti-war conference at Zimmerwald in Switzerland. It was a very small conference, less than 40 people in attendance, but very important. A year earlier, the whole socialist movement, with very few exceptions, had supported their own governments in World War I. And Zimmerwald, this conference, was one of the first attempts to get socialist opponents of the war together, Lenin and Zinoviev wrote this pamphlet as an intervention at the conference. In this period, Lenin embraced the role of reviving and reanimating the revolutionary substance of Marxism that had been covered over by the creeping reformism of the Second International. A breaking point between revolutionary and reformist socialists was reached before this, that precipitated this conference. Another note about the conference was Trotsky wrote a manifesto for it that was unanimously approved. The basic socialist idea, the basic revolutionary socialist idea about war is that we cannot end war within the existing system. And so recognizing this means accepting the hard task of building a revolutionary alternative to those who talk of socialism but work within the system. There must be some good shit happening in the chat. Or I got something on my face. All right. The attitude of socialists towards wars. The Marxist attitude toward war is different from pacifists and anarchists, Lenin starts off saying. He says, we, the Marxists, understand the inevitable connection between wars and class struggle. War cannot be abolished without abolishing classes. We regard wars waged by the exploited and oppressed against the exploiters and oppressors as legitimate, progressive, and necessary. So this is a big difference with pacifists. Lenin also says, Lenin and Zinoviev also say, each war must be evaluated independently. Wars, despite their horrors, can be progressive. For instance, Marx and Engels were enthusiastic supporters of the US Civil War. Well, of the war, but and of the North. And some of their followers, mostly German exiles, fought voluntarily for the Union. Oh, and by the way, these are all stills from Full Metal Jacket. If you don't know that, great flick. Some fit the content better than others, so excuse that, and don't read too much into it, I suppose. So the pamphlet also talks about the difference between an aggressive and a defensive war. Does it matter who started it? A war of the oppressed, this is kind of the conclusion that it comes to, a war of the oppressed, dependent, unequal states against oppressing, slave-owning, predatory great powers is just and defensive regardless of who attacked first. Let's see. He goes on to, or they go on to say, picture to yourselves a slave owner who owned 100 slaves warring against a slave owner who owned 200 slaves for a more just distribution of slaves. This is what Lenin compares World War I to, and certainly would have compared World War II and basically every imperialist war to this type of a situation. And I wanted to reference, well, I wanted to point people to, there's a great article called The Good War on isreview.org that breaks down the Western imperialist, well, the Axis's motivations for entering into World War II. And it's a very different picture than what we learned in school, the good versus evil stuff. The pamphlet also says, astute slave owners deceive us through nationalist ideology and the principle of self-defense, whereas such wars actually fortify and strengthen slavery. And we got to, if we're talking about war, we got to talk about imperialism. Lenin says capitalism needed the nation state to overthrow feudalism. That the national state form was really important for feudalism to be defeated by capitalism. And well, if you don't know, Marxists consider that capitalism in that case to be a progressive thing, right? In the case of slave economies and feudal arrangements. But now capitalism finds the old national states, without the formation of which it could not have overthrown feudalism, too tight for it. I like this phrasing. War is essentially capitalism spilling outside of the national boundaries. And so here's a long quote broken up across a bunch of slides here. Capitalism has developed concentration. Concentration means great wealth in few hands. Capitalism has developed concentration to such a degree that whole branches of industry have been seized by syndicates, trusts, and associations of capitalist billionaires. And almost the entire globe has been divided up among the lords of capital, either in the form of colonies or by enmeshing other countries in thousands of threads of financial exploitation. Free trade and competition have been superseded by the striving for monopoly, for the seizure of territory, for the investment of capital, for the export of raw materials from them, and so forth. From the liberator of nations that capitalism was in the struggle against feudalism, imperialist capitalism has become the greatest oppressor of nations. Whoops, all right, so yeah, so here they're saying not only are some wars progressive, but the nation state form and capitalism itself has been progressive in the historical context of feudalism and literal slave economies. Okay, I already said that. Great, so another great chapter or section heading in this is wars between the biggest slave owners for preserving and fortifying slavery. And they get Lenin and Zinoviev get a great shot in at the so-called great powers and saying what they're great at is plunder. All right, well, here's another quote that to me points toward it in a direction as how we should orient ourselves to contemporary conflicts. It is not the business of socialists to help the younger and stronger robber to rob the older and overgorged robbers. Socialists must take advantage of the struggle between the robbers to overthrow them all. I think this is a good encapsulation of revolutionary defeatism, which we can, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. War is the continuation of politics by other, i.e. violent means. So this is from Clausewitz, the Prussian general and military theorist of the early 1800s. Lenin and Zinoviev say about this quote, Marxists have always rightly regarded this thesis as the theoretical basis of views concerning the significance of every given war. Basically, war is doing with weapons what peacetime diplomacy and economic activity under capitalism is doing, without weapons. Sorry. They say that the governments and the ruling classes of England and France and Germany and Italy and Austria and Russia during World War One pursued a policy of plundering, or before World War One, pursued a policy of plundering colonies and oppressing other nations, of suppressing the working class movement, of enslaving and not liberating nations. World War One is a continuation of this policy, they said. And then they said that war is bad from the perspective of the development of productive forces. And I quote, the possibility of oppressing and robbing other nations perpetuates economic stagnation, because often the source of income is not the development of productive forces, but the semi-feudal exploitation of aliens. I thought that was interesting, that again, pointing to the development of productive forces and progress from a Marxist standpoint. All right. On social chauvinism. Social chauvinism is a term for people who are, or parties who are socialist in name, but chauvinist in deed. It justifies and embellishes, it's a way of justifying and embellishing the governments and the bourgeoisie of one of the belligerent groups of powers involved in a war or conflict. It champions, social chauvinism champions the right of one or other of the great powers to plunder colonies and oppress other nations. It leads to the abandonment of class struggle during the war. And worse, it repeats the bourgeois deception of the people that the war is being waged to protect the freedom and existence of nations. And thereby they go over to the side of the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. So it's not only abandoning class struggle, but it's joining, or it's changing sides in the class struggle, which is worse, right? Yeah, and I wanted to say that this is also a form of campism. We just had a talk on campism last week or 2 weeks ago, and this is also a form of campism. It's by far the more common form, but it's also less frequently called campism. It's just called patriotism, or social, among socialists, social patriotism, social chauvinism, revolutionary defensism is another one that gets thrown around. So, all right. Then the pamphlet references the Basel Manifesto. This was written in 1912 by a special Congress of the Second International, so 3 years prior. And it states that in the event of war breaking out, socialists must take advantage of the economic and political crisis it will cause to hasten the downfall of capitalism, i.e., to take advantage of the government's embarrassments and the anger of the masses caused by the war for the socialist revolution. This manifesto was signed by Kautsky and the other reformist leaders at the time, but then immediately abandoned when the war actually broke out. Lenin called this abandonment, this support for their socialists' own governments, a betrayal of socialism, and said that it signified the collapse of the Second International, which full agreement there. Just a note, we can take cues from the Basel Manifesto, but I think we have to recognize that our predicament differs from that of socialists in that context. There are no ripe conditions for socialism. There are no mass socialist parties in any of the belligerent countries. This is a quote from the pamphlet. He's saying even 3 years later, conditions differed. So this, back to today, the moment may not call for us to raise the slogan, convert the imperialist war to a civil war, right? Like, that's not exactly, music to the ears of anyone but already convinced Marxists under our conditions. But that doesn't mean that it's not our duty to, quote, again from the pamphlet, our duty to systematically and undeviatingly work toward precisely this direction, by exposing the realities of war under capitalism, pointing to its inevitability. On opportunism. So I guess, they don't define it in this pamphlet, opportunism. It's something that was, I think, well known. And, it's like every other word coming out of Lenin's mouth for years, at a certain point. So, but so I have a couple of, I want to contextualize a little bit, some quotes from outside of our source reading. And also, this is a meme from my Kubrick communist meme page called Full Metal Praxis. So it's all Kubrick stills with commie quotes. And so this is from 2001, which I renamed 1917. And anyway, this is Trotsky on opportunism. Sheer political impatience, which wishes to reap before it has sown, leads either to opportunism or adventurism, or a combination of both. And I believe this is Trotsky again from another great Kubrick movie, Barry Lyndon. The fundamental quality of opportunism is submission to the existing powers. So to kind of flesh out the definition, opportunism is a seeking of shortcuts, a lack of definite and firm principles, a willingness to sacrifice the permanent and essential interests of the proletariat, the party, the socialist movement, what have you, to the momentary, transient, and minor interests. According to Lenin, in another source, but I forget where I got this, but he says the opportunist evades taking a clear and decisive stand. He will always seek a middle course. He will always wriggle like a snake between two mutually exclusive points of view and try to agree with both. I think we've seen this. Trotsky also says that the principal psychological feature of opportunism is the inability to wait. And so back to our material. Let's see, the pamphlet says that opportunism expresses bourgeois policy within the working class movement, and then connects opportunism to social chauvinism, saying that they have the same ideological political content, the collaboration of classes instead of class struggle, the renunciation of revolutionary methods of struggle, the helping of one's own government in its embarrassed situation instead of taking advantage of these embarrassments for revolution. Right. And it goes on to say unity with the opportunists actually means today subordinating the working class to its national bourgeoisie. And I feel like we've seen a lot of this like within the DSA recently, most recently and dramatically with the Bowman affair, where the DSA didn't quite expel, but suppressed the Palestine BDS working group, when they wanted to expel Bowman, the senator, for voting for Israel's Iron Dome funding for it. So total betrayal of Palestine to main favor with their electeds, in the exact pattern of the opportunism and social chauvinism that's being described here. On fraternization, so Lenin was a big fan, Marxists are big fans, the revolutionary socialists big fans of fraternization between of the rank and file between warring militaries, armies. One of the most famous examples is the Christmas Truce of 1914 in World War I, in which pockets of German, British, and French troops along the Western Front, in particular, laid down their arms to share cigarettes, bury their dead, sing Christmas carols, and in some places for a few hours, in some places for a few hours, and in others for several days. This pamphlet says that such fraternization shows us how possible it would be to shorten the present criminal, reactionary, and slave owners' war, and to organize a revolutionary international movement if systematic work were conducted in this direction by revolutionaries. And then they get into the idea about that, like they wanted to make a comment about underground organization. This is in the context of criticizing reformist socialists, and basically they implore socialist parties to break with subservience to legality, while also utilizing all legal means to organize the masses and preach socialism. And then there's a funny note in this section where Lenin is being a little overly optimistic. He says, one of the useful results of this war will undoubtedly be that it will kill both anarchism and opportunism. So yeah, not quite. All right. The next section is on revolutionary defeatism, which I mentioned earlier, but we could talk a little more about that now. The piece says, a revolutionary class cannot but wish for the defeat of its government in a reactionary war. It cannot fail to see that its government's military reverses facilitate its overthrow. Socialists must explain to the masses that they have no other road of salvation except the revolutionary overthrow of their governments, and that advantage must be taken of these governments' embarrassments in the present war precisely for this purpose. So I also reread this piece by Hal Draper about revolutionary defeatism, where he defines it as a revolutionary defeatist is not only one who desires the defeat of his government, but one who also does not wish the victory of the enemy camp. Because otherwise we're just flipping the, turning a positive into a negative without offering our own, taking the kind of bourgeois imperialist point of view and of our own country and flipping it on its head, rather than charting an independent course, which generally means not backing other bourgeois governments either. So. Yeah, okay. So next, there's a little section on pacifism. They say that mass anti-war sentiment also takes the form of pacifism, and that we must, quote, utilize these sentiments. I like that kind of cold approach, utilize these sentiments. But we cannot promote the idea that peace without annexations, without the oppression of nations, without plunder, without the germs of new wars among the present governments and ruling classes is possible in the absence of a revolutionary movement. And let's see. Next, they talk about the right of nations to self-determination, to kind of wrap things up. And they say the most widespread deception of the people perpetrated by the bourgeoisie in the present war is the concealment of its predatory aims with national liberation ideology. This, World War I, is a war waged by the oppressors of the majority of the nations of the world for the purpose of fortifying and expanding such oppression. Socialist parties of oppressing countries, especially of the so-called great powers, should recognize and champion the right of oppressed nations to self-determination. Otherwise, we're chauvinists. The championing of this right, far from encouraging the formation of small states, leads, on the contrary, to the freer, fearless, and therefore wider and more widespread formation of very big states and federations of states, which are more beneficial for the masses and more fully in keeping with economic development. And that's about it. That's all I got.